She says she does this all the time, but today.
Okay, I think we're finally live here. Let me just verify that. We are. I apologize to everyone for the delay. We had some technical difficulties syncing everything up between our Zoom and our Facebook tonight, but I hope you're still hanging in there with us. I know that tonight's program is definitely going to be worth it. We thank you so very much. My name is Diane Dahony. I am the Community Service Librarian at the Paul Sawyer Public Library, and I am so honored to have been asked to organize this program tonight with the Kentucky Historical Society for Frankfort's first ever Frankfort Heritage Week. And it kicked off yesterday, but I feel like we're still kind of kicking it off tonight. And I think this is a wonderful group to do that with. I am so very honored, and I thank all of the wonderful authors that we have on the meeting with us tonight for joining us and sharing their knowledge with us. It is Frankfort Heritage Week, so for our local authors roundtable, who better than to have on tonight in this discussion than those who have played such a big role in telling Frankfort's story. So I thank you all for joining us. I thank our audience for joining us on Facebook. If you aren't able to stay with us the whole time tonight, or if you have some folks, your family or friends you know who weren't able to join us, it will be archived on the library's Facebook page. So do send them that way to take a look after the fact. But tonight, this will be just a kind of a panel discussion, a conversation among these authors. And I will be manning the technical side of things. Obviously, I didn't get off too great of a start of that. I told our panel in a whole year of pandemic virtual programming that had never happened to me before, and it happened tonight. So thanks again for sticking around. But tonight I'll be handling the chat. So if you're on the Facebook Live, do put your questions in the chat below the video, and I'll be funneling those through to Stuart Sanders, who's our moderator tonight. And so he can share those with the panel. We're going to start out tonight. As I said, we're happy to be hosting this event this evening in partnership with the Kentucky Historical Society. And Stuart Sanders is going to be our wonderful moderator this evening. And I really think he's going to do a fantastic job. I know he's going to do a fantastic job because he himself is a historian as well as an author. So who better than to really get this conversation going this evening. It's my honor to introduce Stuart. Stuart Sanders is the former executive director of the Perryville Battlefield Preservation Association. He is the author of 4 history books, including his latest, Murder on the Ohio Belle, which examines interpersonal violence, Southern honor culture, and other themes through the lens of an 1856 murder on a steamboat. He now serves as the Director of Research and Collections for the Kentucky Historical Society. Welcome, Stuart.
Thank you.
And we're going to do, just before we begin, before I turn things over to Stuart, we're going to do a quick intro of all of the authors who are on the panel tonight. As you might imagine, they've got some pretty lengthy bios, so hang tight, some of them, because they've done some fantastic work. Nicky. No, but we'll shorten it down so you don't have to listen to me talk too terribly long before we get into this conversation. But I do want to give them credit where credit is due with a little bit of an intro in case you aren't familiar with some of them or their work. So we'll start off with Nash Cox. Nash, can you wave at us there so everybody can see you? Wonderful. Nash Cox is a Frankfort native who has long been interested in local history and has roots extending back to Franklin County's early days. Always fascinated by the word and books, she began working at the library when she was 9 years old and later became an editor, head of the English department at the Baldwin School in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, and executive director of the Kentucky Arts Council from 1974 to 1985. Cox edited the memoir Odyssey in Primetime, which was written by her husband, Robert Louis Shan, and Portrait, Early Families in the Frankfurt Area Before 1860. She has served as past president of Liberty Hall Historic Site. She's a former member of Kentucky Historic Properties Advisory Commission, and she is on the board of a nonprofit academic press based in Louisville, and which is focused on world spirituality. So that is Nash Cox. Welcome, Nash. And with Nash tonight in conversation will be her co-editor on the Portrait Early Frankfurt Families book, Sallie Clay Lanham. Sallie, can you wave at us so everybody can see? Very good. Sallie Clay Lanham is an award-winning artist and teacher. She's a graduate of the Cincinnati Art Academy. She's a resident of Frankfurt with ties to the founders of Frankfurt, Henry Howe and Charlotte Watson of the Carneal Watson House in the Corner of Celebrities. Charlotte actually built Watson Court in honor of her husband, and those families brought about the idea for Nash and Sallie's book, Portrait of Early Families, Frankfurt Area Before 1860. Sallie was born into a family of men and women who served the Commonwealth as legislators, judges, doctors, editors, generals, and ambassadors. Lately, she's been giving talks on the 12 Kentucky women who were leaders in the suffrage movement. These women include her great-grandmother, Mary Barclay, who brought Susan B. Anthony to Kentucky. As a community leader, Sallie is a founding member of the King Center, the Capital Expo, Save the Grand, Beautify Frankfurt, Franklin County Arts Consortium, Capital Seats, Capital Area Guild, and more. So welcome, Sallie. We also have Dr. Doug Boyd with us. Wave at us, Doug. Dr. Boyd directs the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky Libraries and is a recognized leader regarding oral history, archives, and digital technologies. He recently managed the Oral History in the Digital Age, which was funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and that project established current best practices for collecting, curating, and disseminating oral histories. Doug is, let's see here, he authors the blog Digital Omnium, Oral History, Archives, and Digital Technologies, and is the co-editor of the book Oral History and Digital Humanities. He is also the author of the book Crawfish Bottom, Recovering a Lost Kentucky Community, which was published in August of 2011 by the University Press of Kentucky. Welcome, Doug. Now, we also have with us tonight Sheila Mason Burton. Hi, Sheila. Sheila was born, bred, and educated in Frankfort, Kentucky. She was actually born at the Winnie Scott Hospital on 2nd Street, the Frankfurt hospital designated for Blacks, and grew up in South Frankfurt. She completed elementary school at the Mayo Underwood School on Miro Street and received her high school diploma from Frankfurt High. She's a graduate of Kentucky State University and began a career in state government in 1970, and for the last 40 years has worked for the Legislative Research Commission. She has served on numerous boards and commissions in Frankfurt, currently serving on the boards of the King Center, Green Hills Cemetery, Capital City History Museum, Capital Day School, Board of Trustees, and Frankfurt Independent School Educational Foundation. She has served on the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation and is a past president and current member of the Kentucky Historical Society Executive Committee. She's a lifelong member and steward of the St. John African Methodist Episcopal Church and an avid supporter of Kentucky State University and member of the KSU Alumni Association. She has one daughter and 2 grandchildren. Welcome, Sheila. All right. Got 2 gentlemen left here. Nicky Hughes. Welcome, Nicky. Hello. Nicky retired at the end of October 2012 after a 39-year career in public history. He's a graduate of Western Kentucky University who went to work for the Kentucky Historical Society in 1973. While there, he was curator of the Kentucky Military History Museum, the Old State Capitol, and he was museum division's manager. Let's see, he worked on the first design studies for the Kentucky History Center, and working for the Kentucky Division of Historic Properties, he helps care for Kentucky's Capitol and executive mansions. He was a curator of historic sites for the City of Frankfurt's Department of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Sites, and managed the Leslie Morris Park on Fort Hill Civil War site, and he was a founder of the Capital City Museum. He was a long time and very active living history reenactor. He's been a drum major and narrator for Saxton's Cornet Band since 1989, and actually managed the Cornets and Cannons Civil War Sesquicentennial Music Festival for the city of Frankfurt. He's a founding publisher of The Watchdog, which is a newsletter with the goal of improving historical accuracy in Civil War reenacting. And he's the co-author of 3 photographic history books about Frankfort, Kentucky, which were published with Frankfort Heritage Press. And Nicky and Susan recently moved down to Franklin, Kentucky, after living over 40 years in Frankfurt. So they're no longer here in town with us, but we're so glad that Nicky is joining us here tonight. So thank you so much, Nicky. Welcome. And last but definitely not least, we have Dr. Richard Taylor. He is the author of 15 or so books, he says, including 2 novels, many volumes of poetry, and several nonfiction books relating to Kentucky history. A former Kentucky Poet Laureate, he is a Keenan visiting writer at Transylvania University. His book, Elkhorn, Evolution of a Kentucky Landscape, won the Thomas D. Clark Medallion in 2019. He's currently working on a collection of essays with the working title of Fathers. His collection of poetry, Bull's Hell, Poems on the Life of Cassius Clay, will be published in the fall. He's the co-owner of Poor Richard's Books, and he lives right here in Frankfurt on a small farm right outside of town. So you can see we have quite the panel tonight. I just wanted to get those intros out of the way so you had a little bit of information on everybody, but I'm going to hush now and I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful moderator, Stuart Sanders, and get this conversation kicked off. Again, as you have any questions at all, please put them in the chat below the video and we'll get those to our panelists. Thanks so much.
Diane, thanks so much. And happy Frankfort Heritage Week to everybody. And I'm very appreciative of Paul Sawyer Public Library for partnering with the Kentucky Historical Society on this great panel. So thanks to Diane and everybody who organized this. It's wonderful to be here with such an esteemed group of friends and authors, really. I've known a lot of the people on this panel for many, many years, and it's great to be here with you all. And just to start off, and as you heard from that kind introduction from Diane, and as all of you well know, the work of these authors is definitely rooted in a specific place. And that's sort of a theme running through a lot of the works that these authors have written. And, Frankfort and Franklin County, of course, is the focus of tonight's talk. And the first question I'd like to ask is, what was it that interested you in researching and writing about local history in Frankfurt? What was it about Frankfurt or Franklin County that really sort of lit that fire for you to write that book about local history? And Sallie and Nash, since you guys sort of cover early history, I think I'll start with you if that's okay. So Sallie, you want to get us started? What got you interested in researching and writing about Frankfurt and Franklin County?
Well, we thought this project would address a neglected aspect of Frankfurt history, the founding families. The history of capital city pioneer and antebellum families, profiling all segments of the society and all the neighborhoods throughout the community and surrounding area. I wanted to quote Winston Coleman, who said, "The history of an area is best told in the record of the lives of the people." So that is why we did this book, because we thought that the people of Frankfurt, the founders, had lots of stories, and they certainly did.
That's a great legacy, a great book to have too. And Nash, do you have anything to add to that? What was it that really got you interested in doing, local history based on Frankfurt and Franklin County?
I think initially it was a personal interest because roots on both sides of my family go back to the late 18th century. And some lived in the country, some lived in town, but somehow it was just absolutely fascinating to me and made me want to know so much more. I had great insatiable curiosity to learn more. And that's what Sallie and I did in this investigation of the early families.
And Sheila, you too, as was mentioned in your introduction, you were born in Frankfurt. What was it that really sort of locked you in to write about your hometown?
It's very interestingly, I had no thought of writing about my hometown, although, obviously it's very interested in my hometown. But when Frankfurt celebrated, I think its 200th anniversary, Historic Frankfurt, the group the organization, I think led by John Gray, presented a lot of information about the city of Frankfurt. And then after that was done, they looked at it in retrospect, they felt like they had probably not given due respect to the African-American community. And so John approached me with the idea that maybe we should do it. Is there some way we can make up for that? And so we designed a project called Community Memories, which strictly consisted of, doing oral histories and bringing folks in and asking them to bring in their personal photographic collections that they had maintained over the years. And the idea being that we were going to have an exhibit in the old Capitol, which we did, of photographs and oral history excerpts. And after the evening when we presented the Community Memories project, we had so much material. We had 400 and some photographs that we had taken that were just sitting there. We had all of these oral histories, and we could only use, a few of them, and it was just too much material to waste. And that's when I got the idea about maybe we could write a book. And so, the oral history project turned into a Community Memories book.
Well, thanks. And Richard, you too, you've been very rooted in place in terms of your work. What has really inspired you about Frankfurt and Franklin County and has gotten you to write about this area?
Well, I suppose moving into an old house did it for me, and liking to kayak on Elkhorn Creek. And I learned about, I started literally at my front porch and learned about people who lived up and down the creek, including Harry Ennis, who was one of the first federal judge west of the mountains and who owned the property on which I live now, and the Stedmans, to whom Nash is related, and the Stedman, I was familiar with the Stedman mill. And though plenty of Taylors lived here, the only direct ancestor I had who had a connection with Frankfurt, I only discovered about 6 or 8 years ago, came here in a dugout canoe in 1775 with an English tourist, I guess you'd call him, named Nicholas Criswell. And this Taylor, whose name was Reuben Taylor, and his brother Edmund came to investigate land around Midway that their late uncle had owned. Hancock Taylor surveyed Frankfurt, was one of the first recorded Euro-Americans in this area. And unfortunately, he was killed by Indians in 1774. So living here and getting to know people here, one naturally becomes interested in really rich, colorful history of Frankfurt and Franklin County.
And Doug, with your work on Crawfish Bottom, you've really focused on a very specific place in terms of Frankfurt. And what was it that inspired you to tell that story about Crawfish Bottom?
Sheila Mason Burton. Um, so I mean, the backstory was I was working with Sheila on community memories at that same time, working on all the oral history side in terms of the excerpts of that and pulling those together. Quite frankly, my story is not as cool as everybody else's. I honestly was actively shopping for a doctoral dissertation topic. I had, I'd finished my coursework and I was working as an archivist at the Kentucky Historical Society for the oral history collection. And I saw Jim Wallace's talk. Jim Wallace, who conducted most of those interviews, he kind of hit the road with the slideshow where he was kind of given his talk based on a lot of those interviews that he had conducted. And I started to kind of look at those at a slightly different angle. And I was really intrigued by the fact that the neighborhood was no longer there. And what's it like doing, a history of something that's no longer there? I was intrigued by the fact that the neighborhood to many had a bad reputation, yet these oral histories told a different story. And so I was really intrigued by the complexity of the whole thing, that reputation is history versus oral history, and you mix in a little bit of nostalgia and all of that. And so I was living in Frankfurt at the time. I live in Lexington now. It was definitely inspiring once I made the practical turn, which was, I got to find something that, I can work on while I work this full-time job, so that was the practical decision. But as soon as I started to dive in, and I was kind of working that other project, Community Memories, at the same time, it was all the stars were aligning, I think, so to speak.
Yeah, Nicky, you represent sort of a publishing arm of Frankfurt with Frankfort Heritage Press. And, I know there are several people who are on the board of that press. You all have done some great work, multiple volumes on Frankfurt history. What was the impetus to really get Frankfort Heritage Press started? And, what was sort of the inspiration to tell more local stories in Frankfurt specifically?
Oh, it looked like it was going to be wildly financially lucrative. I'm just in it for the money. No, our project started the same as Sheila's, really the same guy, John Gray, suggested that it would be feasible to put together a photographic history of Frankfurt. And I got interested into it when I went to work for the City of Frankfurt's Department of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Sites, both at Fort Hill and then at what would become the Capital City Museum. And it was just an obvious way to extend what that institution was involved in. So we put together a great team of people: Russ Hatter, who did a lot of the research, Gene Birch, who was able to make the pictures look great, Richard Taylor, who wrote introductions for us. It was a certain local artist that provided some decorative material for the books. We started off, we put out word that we would be set up at the coffee shop downtown. Bring your photos in and we'll scan them. And we were just completely overwhelmed. We had no idea that people would be so generous with their images, and adding what we collected that way to what was already in the local archives, the Historical Society and such. We were able to turn out several volumes. And
Bob Lanham designed.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Yep. He's watching, I know, but he's the designer guy who made us look good.
Always important to look good.
Absolutely.
And, they're great books, Nicky. They really are. And one thing about I love about researching local history, and I think all of you probably agree with me, is that it sort of helps us better understand much broader narratives and themes related to state and local history. So we can sort of use a smaller event as the lens through which to view much more larger and compelling stories. And for you all, as you research your books, what were those larger themes that really emerged and became clear? What about Frankfurt sort of tells us about these bigger issues in our state and national history? And Sheila, I'll start with you. What do you think about, sort of through your work, what larger themes have you seen come out?
Well, I have to say that, our book was not Community Memories was not a book about the history a given set of people, Blacks in Frankfurt. Rather, it was a book about a people, those people in a given period of history. So it wasn't a history, it's not a history book, but it has a lot of history in it. And I think in looking at that and you know, in reflecting on on the message that Community Memories gives, you know, obviously there's connectiveness, a connectiveness with African Americans all over the United States who had the same experiences, you know, lived under the same systems, et cetera. So, you know, and that's an obvious connection. You know, beyond that, I think what I see in Community Memories, when I looked at the traditions and values and customs that my people have brought to Frankfurt and Franklin County, it actually crosses cultures. Some of those traditions, some of those values, it crosses cultures. And I remember at the time that we were working on the initial phases of Community Memories, the Historical Society was working on a project involving people who lived on the Ohio River. And I was reading some of those oral histories, and I saw things that they were saying that people that I was interviewing and doing oral histories with were saying also. And I remember Mary Winter, one of the historians down at there, said, you know, Sheila, that's folklore. That's what folk life is about. And so in addition to seeing a connectiveness among African Americans all over the United States, I saw a connectiveness among all of us and some of the cultural traditions that we have.
Well, and Richard, you know, I think I met you when you were starting research on your book about Sue Mundy, the Civil War guerrilla, which you wrote as a novel. You've also written about Simon Girty. You've got your great book on Elkhorn that covers a lot of themes. But what is it about, you know, what are those themes that have emerged for you in doing your research that sort of points to a broader narrative?
Well, with the Elkhorn book, Elkhorn, of course, is a place, and a writer named William Lease Heat Moon, who wrote a book called Blue Highways, came up with a concept called deep mapping. And I decided to take a place, an 8-mile segment of Elkhorn Creek, and write everything about it, that area that I could find from its earliest geological beginnings. Elkhorn's about 12,000 years old. And though we like to concentrate on the settlement part of it, the early settlement, actually Elkhorn had been lived on for 12,000 years by native peoples. And in a way, as you were saying earlier, the smaller world becomes then a reflection of the larger world, or vice versa. And so we see industry develop along the creek. We see the immigrant theme with Macklin. We see racial injustice in the lynching of one of Macklin's employees, one of the darker sides of Frankfurt's history. And so that idea of deep mapping fascinates me, taking a place and gathering everything you can about it and setting it forth in a narrative.
Yeah, and you know, Doug, with your work too, you know, it's again looking at a sort of that micro and then drawing out much bigger themes. So what are some of the ones you found about Frankfurt's history when researching Crawfish Bottom?
I was really interested in the idea of sense of place. That's something that just gets tossed around, you know, in so much that it almost becomes cliche. But I was really trying to figure out, what does that really mean? You know, especially because of my work specifically with oral history, what does that mean from a narrative standpoint? What does that mean from a memory standpoint? And, you know, we've referred to the book Community Memories. I was really trying to use this example as a way to get at this process, and kind of, understand the process of creating community memory. It's complicated, and, memory is complicated when you talk about the individual, but then when you apply that to a community, it I just really was enthralled, I think, by the complexity of the whole thing when you really drill down to the process of how history is constructed, how it's created, you know, how it moves from the mind of one person and that person's memory to this group, even when sometimes, you know, the group gets it wrong.
Yeah, and I think, you know, Nicky, for you, you've, in addition to working with the press, you know, you've been curator of the Arsenal, the Old State Capitol, have a long career, you know, doing public history in Frankfurt specifically. What are some of those bigger themes that you've seen arise out of your work that you think is, you know, important to today?
Rather than reaching out and bringing things global reach to our story, what became powerfully evident to us is what a unique community we were documenting. Frankfurt, there are a couple of other small town state capitals, but not many of them. And there are other elements that enter into the Frankfurt story that just make it very unusual, very unique, and fascinating to try to document it. I don't think there's another state capital where you can see farmers' fields from the windows of the governor's office. And it's always just a small town. It's almost a company town. And with state government as the big company that is the big influence, then you blend into that the bourbon industry, and I really think there's a book needs writing, by the way, detailing the relationship between bourbon and state government. I'm sure that would be colorful, Mr. Boyd. I think that's right up your alley. But it's just such a unique place.
Definitely true. And, you know, Nash and Sallie, with your book looking at early Frankfurt families and sort of, you know, the founders of Frankfurt, what are some of those, you know, larger themes and stories that you think are really relevant to today? What do they teach us about our present day?
Sallie?
Nash, you go first.
Okay, I am just so struck the deeper I go into early Frankfurt history. We had such a nucleus of leaders in Frankfurt who lived here, who were particularly in government, who went on to Washington and were so important in this country's history. And they all lived very much in the same neighborhood. They intermarried, they knew everybody. And it was just an amazing group of people, very talented people who were an important part of our country, and not only the state and the community, but the country. And I think of somebody like George Mortimer Bibb, and now we have a bar on St. Clair. And he was quite an eminent person. I don't know what he would think about having this bar named for him, Mortimer Bibb, not the name he went by, which was George. But there were people like that who went on to great prominence nationally. And we saw a lot of that in our research, working on the book Portrait.
Sallie, you have anything to add on that?
Well, I just think what we did, we stimulated all these people to look into their families and the stories. The book is full of so many interesting stories. I mean, covering everything you can think of. We even had Wilkinson's family ancestors drive all the way from New Orleans to bring pictures of his portrait and write the stories. Now, all the stories in this book, people brought us and we did not edit it. So they could say anything about their ancestors. And we also included about all the different little towns like Leestown. And in fact, we even have in the book a picture, a Filson map that shows Leestown, but not Frankfurt. But it's people have involved this book because all the stories are so interesting. Even if you don't have a family in there, they're just, it's a book full of covering mysteries, and it's just a fun book to read.
Yeah, definitely, Nicky. I think the cemetery book that you all put together does the same thing in a lot of ways. And I want to turn to a comment that Carla put on Facebook. So Carla, thanks for the question. So Carla says she loves all the authors, which is always wonderful to hear. And so thanks for that, Carla. And she would like to know if anyone is working on additional works related to Frankfurt history perhaps a follow-up to community memories. So
Yes.
is anyone currently working on any similar project or other works right now, or books in general?
You know, I'm not working on a follow-up to community memories, although I think there ought to be a follow-up. I just don't know if it's in me. And I'm really
Right.
hope that someone's inspired to do that. But the Capital City History Museum is working on an exhibit on the history of African Americans. And so I'm on that board, but also we formed a similar group like the one that we formed at the beginning of Community Memories. And this group has been meeting, and what we're doing as a community of African Americans advising the History Museum is giving voice to the exhibit. So that should be debuted perhaps sometimes this fall. It's not a book, but
Equally important, though.
yeah.
We love our exhibits, that's for sure.
Yes, we do.
Anybody else working on anything now? Any follow-ups?
I was just going to say that on to add to what Sheila was saying, that in some ways, that book was published, what, 2003, Sheila, is that? Yeah. So the whole, what that does is it really features these photos and these oral histories in this really amazing way. But the role of archives have really changed. The technical capabilities of archives have really changed. Just as an example, last year alone, the Nunn Center, which is the Oral History Center at UK, we had like 213,000 interviews used over the course of the year.
Wow.
You can click on a moment in the interview and it takes you to that moment. And in some ways, the archive has the capability now to do what community memories really did, and that is, to have stories and things that are clickable and searchable at the touch of, a couple clicks of the mouse. And so in some ways that's really exciting as well. Now, of course, it doesn't, the pure access to the stuff doesn't have the interpretive magic that the author or the editors bring to it. So there is always that, or the curators in the case of a digital exhibit. But the role of the archive, if you search around, is really changing far more, I think, than was the case in 2003.
Right, and I think, or go ahead, Nicky.
I'd like to see more of that oral history material incorporated into exhibits, in particular at the Capital City Museum. It's just a whole other dimension of people can talk to you out of an exhibit.
Yeah, and speaking of oral histories, Doug and Sheila, I know both of you extensively used oral histories for various projects that you've worked on.
So did we.
Yeah, and Sallie, you and Nash
Yeah.
did too. And I guess, coming from the standpoint of doing research with oral histories or conducting your own interviews, sort of how valuable were those collections to you? I mean, I think I already know the answer to that, but what really surprised you about hearing, sort of the voices of the past kind of informing your own work?
I mean, just from my experience, the work with Crawfish Bottom, it was really what struck me was how, listening to their voices, you really get a sense for how painful the past was for those who experienced the urban renewal. It really was something that even, decades after, you could still hear, pain and frustration and such. So having the emotional aspect that you get from the human voice is really, I think, really, it just breathes life into things, into words, so to speak.
Well, Sheila, how about you? How valuable were the oral histories that you collected, and what sort of surprised you about that process of doing the interviews yourself?
Well, I think the emotion that came out of those oral histories, but and also the perspective. And I remember when we hired a historian to write community memories. That was the first draft, and it just fell flat because it really was just based on history, and it talked about all of the discrimination and all of the inequities, et cetera, because that was the history. But then when you listen to the oral histories, you didn't hear that. You heard people's, remembering and reminiscing, and you felt love, and you felt, you know, their aspirations, and all of that came out in the oral histories that didn't come out in the history. And so had it not been for those oral histories and the emotion and the feeling and the passion that folks spoke about when they talked about their schools, when they talked about work, you know, some of the most passionate comments were made by Black women who were taking care of white babies. You felt the love that they felt for those kids. And, you know, you can't get it anywhere else but from the person's mouth.
So Nash and Sallie, did you all have a similar experience when you were compiling your book with these oral histories?
Well, Nash, of course, was
Yeah.
in on it, so she should talk about her
Well, we
sister.
had a grant from the Oral History Commission, and my sister, who's a filmmaker, went with me. I took the sound and asked the questions, and she videoed the interviews. And one thing led to another, and it was absolutely a marvelous revelation. We were able to find several people who had lived in the community for some time, like Freddie Johnson's father, whom we interviewed while he was still alive. And then John Clay, who was a farmer, African-American farmer out in Farmdale.
Free Black.
Pardon?
He kept telling us that he lived on the other side of Frankfurt, and they were free Blacks. They were born free Blacks.
And that was a revelation, because apparently there were a whole group of free Black farmers. Never heard of that at all. So we got some wonderful information there, much more than we could use in the book. But everything is now archived at KHS.
And, you know, the Nunn Center too, Doug has done a great job sort of making oral histories extremely accessible. So if anyone watching, you know, has any interest in oral histories, you know, go to the Nunn Center UK, go to the Kentucky Historical Society, and you really get a great overview of what sort of collections are out there. And, you know, Richard, I think one thing I loved about your book, Elkhorn, too, is that it does a wonderful job of really placing Frankfurt's history within the context of the natural world and sort of the influence that the natural world has on the history of the community. And when writing Elkhorn, what sort of hits you the most about that connection between, you know, nature and Frankfurt's past?
Gosh, well, that's a tough question, really, because people were contending with nature. I guess the evolving view of nature was among the earliest settlers. Nature was regarded really as an enemy. It's something to be subdued. And later, of course, it became something that was exploitable. Stedman, Ebenezer Stedman and Macklin both utilized water power and steam and whole acres of timber in order to create steam to make paper. What I guess interests me is the resilience of Elkhorn Creek. That I was on Elkhorn 2 days ago, and despite the detriment of the creek acting really as a sewer for central Kentucky, and that's really what it is. It has fish. It has an incredible resilient beauty to it. It's a magical place. It also has, and I wish I'd known more about this, but it also has a lot of extremely rare plants. One of the most interesting facts I picked up after writing the book was that along the ridge tops of the Palisades of Elkhorn Creek, you can find gravels that were born by glaciers. Now, glaciers weren't in the valley, but the melt of those glaciers at high levels geologically are residual. And that just fascinated me. Probably my favorite story related to the recovery of a mammoth, the remains of a mammoth, which Willard Rouse Jilson was able to extricate from a farm pond just down the hill from me. And it was estimated, he estimated, that mammoth had lived 30 to 50,000 years ago, and it became extinct 12,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. So those kinds of geological facts that they inform history, they shape history. Cultures are formed by geology. Someone like Toynbee said, I love that statement. And Frankfurt is no exception. One other quick point. Elkhorn Creek became the avenue by which the bluegrass region of Kentucky was settled and land laid claim to. Surveyors went right up Elkhorn Creek from what became Leestown. And Leestown itself was it was located there because it was a buffalo crossing, and it was on the wider circuit of game migration in the state. And that the state's highways in this area, Leestown Road notably, Georgetown Road, were formed initially from buffalo traces. Those kinds of details I found fascinating. And there are a lot of them that are yet uncovered.
Yeah, and the mammoth story in your book, I think, was my favorite section, actually, Richard. So I loved it. I thought it's a great book, and that was my favorite section. And Nicky, I think I'm going to turn this question to you. We had a viewer ask a question, and John Carlton said that Cable 10 has revived Historic Frankfurt seminar series during this week for Frankfort Heritage Week. And John asked if someone can speak to the beginning and influence of John Gray and his Historic Frankfurt organization and the effect it had on revitalizing interest in Frankfurt history, tourism, preservation, and more. So what sort of influence, did John Gray have with his organization and, everything from, local history to preservation?
John Gray has gotten me into more trouble than anybody else because he has generated over, the last 30 years at least, probably even more than that, powerful ideas of specific things that needed to be done to preserve history and make history more popular in Frankfurt. The Fort Hill's status as a functional historic site would never have happened without John Gray, frankly, making a nuisance of himself with city government. And that really, John's very good at making a nuisance of himself, but people respond to that. But that was the moving force behind that whole project. And then Frankfort Heritage Press, he was the one who very first instigator of we could publish books about Frankfurt history, in particular picture books about Frankfurt history. And then, of course, he was involved with the publication of the history of Frankfurt and Franklin County, Capitol Kentucky. So yeah, John, I wouldn't say he deserves a statue because that would inflate his ego far too much, but probably he does.
Yeah.
Maybe
a
historical marker.
And Nash and Nicky and probably some of the rest of us and Sallie can remember the early historic Frankfurt groups and Bill Pruitt and others who were very active in not only discussing Frankfurt's history, but in visiting sites. And Nicky, I know you were involved with the driving tour of Franklin County, and this came as a result of the inventory which the Kentucky Heritage Council did on historic structures in Franklin County. And a lot of those places were documented as a result of John's gentle plotting and his bringing people together. And so for the time I've been here, there's been a core of people interested in Frankfurt's history and exploring that history in very tangible ways.
Oh, and John was the real push behind the Frankfurt in the Civil War book we published too.
Right.
He drove that to completion. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone else have any comments about Mr. Gray at all? Or
This could turn bad, you know. Better.
Of course, we did have, back then too, we also had an Elkhorn Landholders Association, and he was involved with that, of course.
very busy man. And we had another great question from the viewer comments. So thanks for sending those in. Please keep commenting, and we'll try to answer your questions. Someone asked this question: are there any unanswered questions or mysteries that any of you still wish to find answers to, pertaining to Frankfurt history or kind of regional history? Is there any area where you feel like you've hit a dead end? Anyone have an answer for that?
Who killed Bill Goebel?
Yeah, who killed Governor Goebel is always a good one.
I'd like to know more about the Pappy Van Winkle heist.
That's
Yes.
right.
Yeah.
We have stolen bourbon. We have an assassinated governor. Any other mysteries that we've got?
Well, the whole conspiracy, General Wilkinson and payoffs from the Spanish and the whole Spanish conspiracy.
Honest Dick Tate, the state treasurer,
Yes,
who disappeared.
Honest
with the
Dick
treasury. Where's he? Where's the money?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the fun thing about Kentucky history. I think, full of mysteries and good questions. And viewer, we appreciate that question. Sheila, I think, we've talked a little bit about this, but when working on the community memories book, what was the favorite thing you sort of uncovered, or the most surprising thing that you uncovered about Frankfurt's African-American history? Is there anything that sort of sticks in your mind as being, a great surprise to you?
Not really, because these are stories, the stories that I was hearing from community members are stories I've heard all my life from my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother was born in Hickman Hill, which is out 421. And she lived to be almost 100. So she lived with us. So, I was about 10 when she died. She was the nanny to Ruth, of Rebecca Ruth. And she also was the daughter of the man who owned them as slaves. She was born 2 years in 1865, 2 years.
Wow.
Patient. So I've heard all these stories all of my life from my parents. I've heard about Mayor Underwood from the elders in the community, and there's no African proverb that says tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter until the lion tells the story. And I don't mean that in any negative way. It's the proverb. But there are different interpretations of that. But what that means to me is that it simply says that the content of a story and the way it's told depends on the perspective and experiences of who's telling that story. And so there's so many stories I've heard all my life. And this was a chance to give those stories, to use those stories to give our lives as African-Americans some context and some purpose. And so I can't say that anything was said that surprised me. I think what really thrilled me, though, was that the community really embraced the fact that we need to tell our story.
Right. Well, I know Richard loved that comment so much he actually wrote down the proverb.
I did. I think it's a great. I try to write down the clever things, Sheila, and that was really a great one. And it's so appropriate to the history that we are beginning to explore in the lives of African Americans in this country. And, the 1619 Project, and getting an alternate and perspective on our very complicated history.
But Richard, you know, when you think about that proverb, though, again, you know, proverbs are universal. It doesn't just apply to my culture. It applies to any. If you've got a story, don't let other people's story define you. And so that depends. You know, I mean, that's just not conditional on any culture.
Right. Great proverb, though.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what do you all think of doing your research about Frankfurt? You know, thinking about history being that lens through which we essentially view the present in a sense. What's the greatest misunderstanding that sort of modern Kentuckians have about African-American history in Frankfurt? And Sheila, I'll open up to you or anybody else, you know, Doug, with your work. You know, what do you all think sort of the greatest misunderstanding is about African-American history in this region?
Well, you know, I think maybe a misunderstanding about just African Americans in general, but particularly maybe in Frankfurt, is that the conditions under which they lived, obviously they're changed now. But when I look at my great grandmother and my grandparents and my parents, the conditions under which they lived did not define them. They still live their life. And if you look at the chapter that we do on the churches in Frankfurt, you know, the name of that chapter is Hallelujah Anyhow. And that's the kind of life that they led. So people might think that, you know, we as Blacks, you know, lived under this victimization. No, I mean, those might have been the conditions, but we didn't let that define our lives. We said hallelujah and went on and lived a life anyway.
Yeah.
Doug, anything to add about Crawfish Bottom? I mean, was there anything that your research sort of found that surprised people?
I'm going to pull from community memories too, because I did maybe 5 or 6 of those interviews.
Right.
And I'll never forget a moment, and it was a really pivotal moment in my life. I was sort of a young, you know, historian and you know, with my white perspective going into an interview, I remember somebody telling me about, you know, when the schools desegregated and talked about how, you know, I'm thinking, this is great. This is the schools desegregated. And he had this moment where he looked at me and said, it wasn't all good. And I had this moment of like, what do you mean? And it was really amazing when he sort of talked about the community teachers, the teachers who were part of the communities, who knew the parents of the kids and you know, went way above and beyond. Those teachers at Mayo Underwood were, you know, to hear people talk about the teachers, it was incredible. And then have that be gone, you know, was something that was really to be suddenly in with teachers who weren't part of their community, who weren't as deeply caring. That was a real awakening moment, I think, for me, just personally, to see this, you know, having studied history academically and thinking, you know, 1954 Brown versus Board of Education, this was great. And then there was this moment of like, there's a different side to that. It obviously was a great thing historically, but it's more complicated.
Right.
Any other panelists care to comment? Anything to add on African-American history in Frankfurt?
Well, that's why you must read the oral histories in our book that John Clay wrote. He was a farmer on the other way over, and he was so proud of his heritage. And like I say, he kept saying we were free Blacks. And the stories that he told us that are in our book, I mean, like one where the circus came to town and they couldn't bring the elephants across the bridge, so the elephants walked across the river, because at that time the river was a lot lower because it was before we had the lock. I mean, but it's full of his story and his pride, and his eyes lit up. I mean, John Clay, you've got to read those in our book, those oral histories.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we had a great question from the audience again, from a viewer, and they said, whether you use the information or not in your writing, what is your favorite history book, author, pamphlet, or article that you ran across in your research? Richard, you want to get us started? Do you have a favorite?
I would say, well, Willard Rouse Gilson deserves a lot of credit. His early Frankfurt is a key piece of work, and other books he wrote, in addition to his multi-volumes on geology, are really essential to get a clear understanding of early Frankfurt.
Very prolific too. That you wrote a lot. And Nash, how about you? Is there any sort of book or author or pamphlet that really sticks with you about Frankfurt history, or any other thing?
One person I wanted to mention is Hermione Darnell. And I've read a good many things that she has written, and her granddaughter, Becky Darnell Bolton, was also a primary person working on our book. But the stories that she tells and the connections, the family lineage that she discusses in her book is just phenomenal. It's a great resource. And I've gone back to her books many times.
What's her name again? One more time, just for the viewers.
Hermione Darnell.
Right. Thank
But
you.
those, some of those books are just in manuscript form.
Neat. Great. Nicky, how about you? Any you know, sort of favorite book, author, pamphlet, article?
It's not specifically Frankfurt, but I'll take this opportunity to put in a plug for Lowell Harrison, who was one of the greatest Kentucky historians of our time. And I don't know if anybody but me still remembers the bicentennial bookshelf books that were done in the 1970s. He did one on the Civil War in Kentucky, which if you're interested in the history of this state, you got to read it.
Right. Yeah, his Lincoln of Kentucky too is great. You know, one of the better books on the Civil War in Kentucky, I think. Sallie, how about you?
He wrote about Kentucky governors too, which obviously ties into Frankfurt.
Definitely.
Well,
How about you, Sallie?
Nettie Glenn wrote a history of Frankfurt, which is very interesting. So I might throw her name in there.
So Sheila, what stuck with you? And any authors or articles or books?
Well, you know, the Black church has always been a cornerstone of the Black community. And Dr. E.E. Underwood wrote a book on the early history of the early churches in Frankfurt. If you don't know Dr. E.E. Underwood, you all need to read on him. He is just one fascinating person who he's a Black. You may wonder what was named of him, but he came here to be the assistant city physician. So he was a physician, he was a minister. He was the first Black appointed to Kentucky State Normal Schools Board of Regents. He was big in the Republican Party. I mean, he's just a fascinating man. And he took time to write this book documenting churches that are no longer existing. Some are existing now, but some are no longer existing. And so it was really nice to be introduced to his writing.
Doug, how about you? Is there any book or author or source that sticks out?
I have to take this moment to I'm going to pick historian as the category, specifically oral historian, and call out Jim Wallace. Give him a shout out, because the work that he did, I think, as a graduate student, to do those interviews that I ended up using for Crawfish Bottom, I refer to him in the acknowledgement sections of the book as the Luke Skywalker of the story in so many ways. And he's a great interviewer, and he just dug in and did so many interviews, and there's such great resources.
Yeah, and someone who's done, you know, so much great work for the Kentucky Historical Society over the years, and you know, one of my favorite people that I've worked with at KHS, definitely.
And with that, I always tell people I have a great memory for names and dates, and that memory is named Russ Hatter.
Oh yeah.
And there's a walking, living, breathing encyclopedia of Frankfurt history.
Absolutely.
And Frank Sauer was also mental history. I mean, he would drive you around and tell you about the stories in all these houses sitting in your car, all in his head. If you were going to do a tour, you'd go around the town with Frank Sauer, and he would tell you all these things, and you'd take notes so you could remember.
That's one thing I've learned to love about Frankfurt too. You know, it's there are a lot of counties that'll have sort of one historian who's sort of the person with all the stories, but you know, for Frankfurt and Franklin County, there's certainly a lot of people who are definitely enlightening in terms of the community's past, which is wonderful. And Nicky, I want to turn this next question to you, and we'll be wrapping up in just a few minutes. But Frankfort Heritage Press, of course, has published books on Paul Sawyer, the Civil War, the cemetery, and sort of on and on. And what are some topics about Frankfort's history that you think need to be written about in the future? What are some underserved?
There are two.
stories?
If my former colleagues at Frankfort Heritage Press are watching, there are two I want to suggest to them powerfully. South Frankfort, another picture history like we've done for Frankfurt in general, could easily be done on South Frankfurt because it is such a unique neighborhood. If Frankfurt's a unique state capital, that's a unique neighborhood. Here's this quiet residential nice neighborhood with the state capitol plopped right in the middle of it. And then if you go back into the history of the community, it used to be much more of an industrial area than we think of it. There were distilleries, there were sawmills, and the change and evolution in that neighborhood over time, I think, cries out to be documented in another one of those books. Also, and this is just my personal whim, somebody needs to do a good history, and I think preferably a picture history of the Kentucky National Guard and the militia volunteer units that were its antecedents. There's a tremendous amount of information not being used on that. Tremendous number of images, photographs, paintings, pictures, and it's an absolutely vitally important story that needs to be told. And it should be done, I think, by somebody in Frankfurt, because Frankfurt's always been the headquarters of the National Guard. It's where it was run. And this is where a whole lot of the records related to it are archived.
Does anyone else have comments? What books would you like to see written? Are there any stories, places, or people who need their story told? That was a comment from a viewer too. What's missing that needs telling? Any ideas? Well, let me ask you a different question then. My friend and colleague, Keith Jackson from the Kentucky Historical Society, came up with this one, which I really like. What person from Frankfort's history would you most like to have dinner with, and why?
James Wilkinson.
Wilkinson?
Yeah.
Yep.
Margaret Brown.
So why Margaret Brown? What interests you about Margaret Brown, Nash?
She was really an incredible woman. She came from New York City. Of course, it was a small place then, but she came in 1801 to Frankfurt, which was just a real frontier. And she was married to one of the first senators from Kentucky, John Brown. And she was just in her late 20s. When she came, she was already pregnant and had one little child, plus carrying another. And while she was here, she was very much a part of the community, and of course started a Sunday school. She was very interested in the world and what was going on in the world. She and her husband had an amazing library, and she was a very enlightened and cosmopolitan woman who had the latest styles in clothing and decorative art.
Tell about Lafayette.
She was,
Tell her
yeah,
Lafayette with a T.
when Lafayette came, had tea with her.
Well, Richard, how about you? What
I was just thinking, Margareta is certainly an interesting woman. One of her neighbors and friends was Anna Ennis, and Anna came to Frankfurt very early from, I think, Philadelphia, and was thrust into a cabin which the remains of which are integrated in a house now on Elkhorn Creek. And unlike her husband, she lived a much longer period. I think she died maybe in the 1850s. And so she raised children, and her family intermarried with the Crittenans and others. I would like to have gotten her perspective on things, especially growing up on the frontier.
Well, Sheila, how about you? Is there anybody from Frankfurt's past you'd like to go have dinner with?
Yeah, for me, I think it would be Mary J. Robb. Because she came here, she was recruited to come to Kentucky State School for the Normal by the first president, Jackson. So she came here to be a music teacher, and she ended up marrying a Frankfurt businessman, Thomas K. Robb. Ms. Robb was from a fair-skinned family. In fact, I think there were about 6 siblings. She and one other sibling decided to be Black, even though they could have passed for white. And she went on to, be one of the founders of the NAACP here, and at the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. And I actually knew her because she lived to be 100.
Wow.
So, little girl, when she died, I'd love to sit down and talk to her about her experiences here.
Well, Doug, how about you? And then I'm going to follow up with you with another specific question, Doug. But who would you, go grab a meal with? Who's your choice?
There's a top 4, and that top 4 are all come out of the Crawfish Bottom research. Some would think that Ida Howard, the famous madam, who the stories that could be told. John Wallace, who was an over-the-top character. Dinner with John Wallace would be really.
That would be fascinating.
That would be fascinating.
So, E.H. Taylor, because we do a lot of oral history work with the bourbon industry and just the entrepreneurism. But my top candidate, my top dinner would be somebody named James Squeezer Brown. Squeezer Brown was a resident of Crawfish Bottom. He was known as the sort of Pied Piper, and he played music, he played guitar. There's a great picture of him in the book that I think Nash Cox took of, I think that we used in the book. And Squeezer Brown was like the Pied Piper. He would, he wasn't very rich, but he would have all the kids following him while he played music, playing the guitar, and he'd buy them candy at the local store. I think the stories that he would have to tell would be amazing.
Well, related to Crawfish Bottom, one question we had 2 actually. Somebody asked if you came across either Brother Ellis or Reverend Ellis from the Craw in your research.
I'm going to defer that to Sheila.
Okay, Sheila, do you have any comments on Reverend Ellis?
Yeah, I remember Reverend Ellis. And in fact, he was blind, and he was the husband of Mary E. Ellis, Mary Emma Tracy. And I think a lot of folks know Mrs. Ellis because she also lived to be 100 or nearly 100. She died in our recent lifetime, and really made a big mark on. She would probably be, if I didn't know her so well, she'd be the person I'd want to have dinner with. But I've had dinner with her.
That's right.
Doesn't count.
Reverend Ellis still has great grandchildren here.
Wow.
So if anyone wants to get in touch with that family, I can get them in touch with.
That's great. Yeah, we had 2 questions about him, which is great. And for the final question, and I appreciate the panelists' patience with our time. It's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you all for being here and being part of this. But Richard, I'll throw this first one to you. Since everyone here is sort of is written on local history, and Richard, you've taught literature and writing. What advice would you give to anyone who is thinking about writing their own book about local history? If you could boil down some good advice, I'll start with you, then hand this off.
Take good notes, keep good files, so you won't have to cover things again. And if it's going to be written as history, to document everything you do. Searching for things you misdocumented or failed to document is a royal pain.
Very true. Nicky, what do you think? Any comments?
Bibliographies, footnotes are as important as anything you'll write.
Yeah.
Nash, how about you? Any advice for aspiring local history authors?
I agree with those 2 comments. The documentation is really critical.
Doug, how about you? Any good words of wisdom?
Use the archive.
Yeah, definitely use the archive.
It's there for you, and there's so many hidden hidden gems in the archive.
And it's more accessible than people think too. I think, people who go for the first time are really surprised how easy it is and how helpful archivists are. And, as everyone here knows, archivists are historians' best friends, definitely. Sheila, how about you? Any closing thoughts on writing local history?
Yeah, I would say, don't forget what a great resource local folks, the memories of local folks are. However, make sure that you remember that that's their memory. The memory, people remember different things, different ways, but it's a great way to lead you to what's important to document. And so if you do rely on memory, make sure you source it as someone's memory.
Very true. Sallie, any final thoughts on writing local history?
Well, that's true. On ours, people brought their stories and we did not edit them. We left them what they said as truth as they remembered. But if you're writing a book, the most important person is your proofreader.
Right.
At the end, the proofreader.
My
Right,
wife,
definitely
the
have a
editor
proofreader.
sitting here, is cheering now.
Well, thank you all for being here. I'll turn it over to Diane in just a second. I just want to say,
Thank you.
personally, thank you all for being here and being part of this conversation. Also, on behalf of Kentucky Historical Society, I know, all of you have been involved with KHS in one way or the other. Some are former colleagues, some are former board members, some are current board members. Several worked with the Oral History Commission. And, on behalf of KHS, we're sort of just so thankful of the work you've done and the energy and love you've put into local history and sort of preserving it. So on that note, I say thank you and thanks for being here. Diane, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stuart.
Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thank you all so very much. This has been absolutely fantastic. What a wonderful conversation. Again, just want to let everyone know that this will be archived on our Facebook page, the Paul Sawyer Public Library Facebook page. So do point folks that way so they can hear this wonderful conversation. I know that they won't regret it. Thank you to our partner for this event, the Kentucky Historical Society. Thank you to Stuart for being such a fantastic moderator.
Oh, thanks.
Round of applause for you. Thank you to each of our participating panelists tonight. Appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to be with us and discuss all things Frankfurt history tonight. Each of you have played such an important role in the telling of our city's story. And I hope to see even more out of each of you in the future. I love the idea, some of the ideas that were thrown around tonight. So hopefully somebody will pick some of those up and run with them. So I'll be keeping an eye out for that. As far as the library goes, I would like to just put in a little plug that the Paul Sawyer Public Library does have all of the books written by these fine folks on this panel tonight. So if you'd like to take a look, come down and check those out. We would love to see you at the library. Also, of course, this event was part of Frankfort Heritage Week, our town's first ever Frankfort Heritage Week. It's just Monday, so we have a whole week full of wonderful events that are going to be going on. Some are in person, but most are still virtual. But you can actually find a full schedule of those events by checking out the Frankfort Heritage Week Facebook page. You can just type in Frankfort Heritage Week on Facebook and you'll find that. Also, if you happen to be by the Paul Sawyer Library, we have the full schedule printed out on our bulletin board at the rear entrance. As you're coming up the stairs, you'll see the full schedules. So you might take a look at those. And thank you to all the organizers for Frankfort Heritage Week and for all the hard work that everyone has put in. It's a fantastic schedule of events. And I do encourage you to take a look at what else will be going on this week and take part in some of those other programs. So just to wrap things up, thank you again to Stuart, our moderator. Thank you again to all of our authors. Thanks Nicky and Doug and Nash and Richard and Sheila and Sallie. We appreciate you so very much. Please keep telling Frankfurt's story. And I thank you all very much on behalf of the library, and we wish you a very good evening.
Thanks, Diane.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.